processes. I want to start by talking a little bit about why we need to be investing in democracy. Democracy has been described as a dictatorship of elections, which I found a really interesting term when I first came across it. And it's really because representative democracy is based on the idea that people have needs and people find politicians that respond to their needs and they vote them into power. And the basic idea is that you actually delegate your power to your representative. And the only way you can really sanction them is to vote them out of office in 3 years' time. And it seemed to us that people are really no longer willing to give their power away. Some citizens are angry and are turning away from a political system which seems totally divorced from their reality. And we've seen a rise in protest in recent times. And many people are just not satisfied with ticking a box on a ballot paper every few years. As well, I think many contemporary policy issues are just too complex for a simple yes or no answer. And so we're also seeing a rise in populism and fundamentalism. And we're also seeing apathy. And all of these, to me, are a symptom of a democratic process which has become oligarchical and has lost its way. So this is where trust comes in, and to rebuild trust in representative democracy, people need to feel their concerns are being taken seriously and that there can be a place for them beyond voting. Some people would say that democracy itself needs to be democratised. And this is where government with the people comes in. Government with is, I'm taking a lot of this material from a paper by David Matthews, who is the president of the Kettering Foundation in the US, which is a research not-for-profit organisation which looks at democracy from citizens' perspectives. And he said, you know, we once talked of government for the people and by the people, but what we really need now is government with the people. Democracy can be seen as a place where citizens work with other citizens to produce public goods which make life better for everyone. It's a kind of way of life issue. And then the governing system is a means of organising those citizen processes. And Matthew says these two systems, one government and one civic, are interdependent in the ecosystem of democracy. Citizens, I just want to go back, sorry. Citizens can't be left on the sidelines because their work is needed to reinforce and complete the work of democracy. So I think recently, despite a trust in government in most countries during the start of the pandemic, in general, democratic institutions are experiencing declining public confidence and a kind of perception that they're pursuing their own ends and not those of the citizenry. And you could even argue, I think, that Australians today are dissatisfied with many aspects of how governing is practiced, but they don't have a clear idea of what an engaged democracy could look like. And this is where I think the David Matthews work is really important, because it provides a different way of thinking about democracy, and it can open the idea of new ways of acting. So if you think about government with, it's very different from government for or even government by. And I think this reframing is important, and it leads to a number of other aspects where democracy is not just a destination, but it's really a work in progress. And there are many ways of strengthening democracy. You know, we could look at ICAC, we could look at accountability of representation, which CAPAD is looking at with our MLA group. You can look at donations, managing political donations. You can look at reform of candidate selection processes and strengthening the relationship between representatives and the citizens, like work in INDI. But today we're looking at involving citizens in credible deliberation on important public policy decisions as one way of strengthening democracy and trust in democracy. So I'm just going to put this there. So, sorry, just go back. So to look at deliberation, we need to be clear about what we mean by that. And according to the OECD, it means a process where we weigh carefully both the consequences of various options and the views of others. It requires access to accurate, relevant information from diverse perspectives, adoption of broadly shared criteria for reaching decisions, and the application of those criteria to propose solutions, weighing trade-offs and finding common ground for group decisions. Deliberation goes much beyond consultation. It's a kind of a non-linear learning together process, which enables people to have a more comprehensive view of the realities they face. And I think one of the things that it does is that it enables people to move from opinion to informed judgment. And that again was some of the feedback that we got when we talked to participants in the ACT processes, where they said, I had no idea of the complexity, and I feel like my opinion now is based on fact and evidence and a consideration of the complexities rather than just my gut reaction. I think the other thing where deliberation is really important is that a lot of the big issues facing us actually have a moral dimension. And so it's important that information is considered, but it may be that doing the right thing is also very important, and this requires citizens to talk together. To talk a little bit more about trust, I was incredibly taken with the phrase that deliberation and participation are not just fancy ways for the elites to have their say. And this piece comes from Kaju Holken, who's a senior public servant in the Finnish Ministry for Finance. And she says that when we're faced with a crisis, we need to build trust as a way not only of strengthening democracy, but of strengthening society itself. Citizens need to trust government, but government needs to trust the citizens also. And citizens need to trust each other if we are to deal with the challenges that affect everyone. And I think we've seen an example of this with COVID. In the beginning, when trust in government was high, there was a high degree of compliance and a lot of goodwill across the community. As we've gone on, the trust in government is perhaps a little less, and the community response is also not as consistent. Kaju goes on to say, and remember this is someone from the Ministry of Finance talking, the crisis, such a crisis hits those who are hardest, who are already disadvantaged. And yet society is everyone's business. To deal with the risks that affect all of us, we need processes so that no one feels like an outsider. Sorry, this has a mind of its own, so I'll just move back. And she says, all groups need to be involved at an early stage, and too often involvement has been too late in the policy cycle. She goes on to say that it's not only policy that's hard, it's implementation. And that without that trust between government and the people and each other, and government trusting the people, implementation won't happen. And again, I think the COVID situation bears this out. So how do we build this trust? one way is to ensure that our deliberative processes are trustworthy. Now, the OECD report, Catching the Deliberative Wave, found that well-conducted deliberative processes can lead to better outcomes, better policy outcomes, enable policymakers to make hard choices without so much political risk, and enhance trust between citizens and government. And this can help to counteract polarisation and misinformation, two of the curses of our current system. The OECD report, which I would highly recommend if you've got a spare few hours, you know, it is a long report, but there's a lot of really useful and interesting information in there. You can dip into it. Was based on 282 cases and 755 individual juries or panels. And they covered processes from 20 OECD countries, including 48 from Australia, over the period 86 to 2019. And they're assessed against 60 variables. So it was a very comprehensive study, and we were really privileged, as I said, that the University of Canberra invited us to be part of some of the considerations that the OECD people took part in. And when they came out, when one of the lead authors came to Australia, we were able to talk with her and hear her presentations on this study. So it was, and we had the chance to provide a little bit of feedback, which we were pretty chuffed about. So there's a lot in that report, but the part I think that's relevant for us today is the good practice principles. Just take it over. So they, talking to a whole range of people in consultation, you know, practitioners and policymakers from civil society and academia. The OECD report talks about these 11 principles, and I won't go into detail on them, sorry. But you can see that purpose, clarity of purpose is really important, accountability of the process, transparency, inclusiveness, not just representation, but making sure that people who may not often have a voice in these processes. The importance of information from diverse sources, enough time, a proper group deliberative process. Now, before this happened, the ACT government committed to holding a number of deliberative processes in 2017 and 18. And in response, GCPAG partnered with ACCOS to develop its own good practice principles. And interestingly, we also came up with 11. And these criteria were to assess the trustworthiness of such processes. We were really thrilled that when we came to look at what the OECD had come up with, our principles stacked up pretty well. And I'm just going to, you don't need to read this, but I wanted you to see that we actually mapped the processes that were developed locally against the OECD processes and saw that there was a very strong match. The one thing that we didn't pick up on was privacy, which is around privacy of those who participate. But we were also a little bit stronger on broader engagement and in the need to embed these processes more broadly in the broader political process. So again, if you're interested, I have written a paper which isn't finalised yet because I'd like to include the conversations we have today and any new ideas that come up. But we have done quite a detailed comparison there. And I'd, at this point, like to really thank ACCOS for their help with this. As a small jurisdiction, the ACT is well placed, in fact, to be a leader in reviving trust in democracy by including genuine participatory deliberative process into policy making. And they proved this in 2017-18, by running 4 processes: the carers voice panel, which Petra was pretty closely involved with, compulsory third parties insurance citizens jury, which we all observed in various ways, better suburbs and housing choices. And the latter 2 also our group had some observer status with. We had, I think CAPAG as a whole had a little bit of influence in actually bringing these processes onto the agenda, and we were really thrilled that the ACT government did this, but we're a little bit disappointed that there wasn't an evaluation. And so we conducted an informal citizens review based on observing the processes, participant commentary, as Mark said. We ran a couple of meetings over food and wine, actually, to talk to participants and to gain their feedback on the process. And we also looked at international experience. And so we used our 11 criteria to look at those 4 processes. And we came up with 10 key findings. I think one of the key learnings was that individual projects, even if they're done really, really well, don't necessarily lead to change in the system. And I think this is really important. So just to give you a bit of flavour, I guess what we found was from the feedback that we got, that a diverse range of people can address complex issues and deliberate in the public interest, regardless of educational standards, status and political interest. One of the key things people said to us was that they grew to respect the other people in their group. Even if in the beginning they might have made a judgment that they had nothing in common. This PowerPoint has a mind of its own. But by the end, they were able to listen respectfully to each other and to work together. So I think that's a very important part of that building trust, not only between government and the people, but across the community as well. The people who spoke to us really valued the experience. They felt they'd learned a huge amount. And I think this again is important in building capacity. The next major thing was that the quality of the design and the facilitation were really critical. There was quite a range of perspectives on that, where facilitation was really fantastic in some and perhaps could have been a little better in the other, and including in design as well. And I guess it really reinforced that point that doing these projects is not necessarily going to make the change. It's actually the change in the system that is important. So again, in the OECD report, and I think from our own learning as citizens, we came to think that institutionalising citizen deliberation is really important. And this can be done, it's important because it enables governments to make better decisions and often to pass the buck in a way, so that when something is really difficult or controversial, citizen deliberation can enable the government to be a little bit arm's length. I think that it also provides wonderful opportunities for strengthening the capacity of people to participate in democracy, and it can build social capital. Now, the routes to institutionalisation can be a permanent or ongoing structure, or you can have a requirement for public authority to organise deliberative processes, or you can have rules. But what we're going to talk about briefly today is institutionalisation of a process into the structure of government. And this is the Ost-Belgian model. which is a world first. Now, I don't expect you to see all the detail in here, but I thought I'd show it to you because we can talk in terms of the colour. Now, what's interesting here is that this is a citizen involvement structure, citizen deliberation, that runs in parallel with the government of Oost-België, which is a province in the east of Belgium. It's quite small, 76,000 people, but they have instituted a citizens' council here of 24 members chosen by sortition, and their responsibility is to set the legislative agenda for citizen participation. So they work closely with government, but they're separate from government. So that's this yellow bit. There's 24 members representing a diverse range of people in the community. They're supported by a funded permanent secretariat, and their function is also to run a number of citizen assemblies on policy issues that they have chosen themselves. So in its simplest form, this is sort of like the coordinating committee, and these citizens' assemblies of about 50 people each, chosen by sortition, will contribute to the policy setting agenda for Oost-België. This has only just begun, and it's, I think, again, before we sort of think, oh, what a great idea, it's taken a very long time to come about, and it's been only as successful as it is, I think, because there's been bipartisan support, and just building that has been a very important part of getting this set up. And perhaps if you like, we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. The other thing that's important is that anyone can become part of this system, anyone who lives in this area over the age of 16, and they don't have to, but they do have a per diem paid so that they enable as many people as possible to join in this system. So that's an example of institutionalising a deliberative process into the political system. There's also an accountability mechanism between this citizens system and the Parliament, so that Parliament, once a recommendation has come from this area, Parliament must respond to it and give, if they don't agree, to give reasons why they don't. So I'm not putting this forward as a model for the ACT, but I think it's a really interesting example of a different approach to citizen involvement. So finally, simply initiating more participatory deliberations, no matter how well they're conducted, will not necessarily result in government with the people. While innovations are worth, such as setting up the Citizens' Assembly, as in Oost-België, are worth exploring, it's important to understand that structural change is not a solution on its own. As I said earlier, there are a great deal of work done across party lines in Belgium and a great deal of research that was done, and a lot of expert input on democratic processes, so that this didn't happen overnight. It took several years before they were able to implement that. So what that says for us, I think, is that groundwork needs to be done if innovation is to lead to better democracy. Politicians, public servants, the media and the citizenry need to be on board, or it just becomes a token exercise. There needs to be engagement of bottom-up community deliberation, so the community also builds its capacity for agenda setting, deliberation and monitoring government accountability. further experimentation beyond Australasian, which the whole world is watching, by the way, because it's really is a first, and things like the Indi model in Victoria are also needed. You know, we're all learning in this, and I guess it's looking at what's happening, seeing what we can learn from them, and moving ahead to, sorry, our phone doesn't respect our Zoom meeting. And so learning, and I think the other thing that's really important is that it's not easy to just take, you know, say the Ostbelgian model and bring it to Canberra. It needs, what we need to do here is to build something that suits our context and works for us. There is a little bit of support from this, from the 2019 Latimer Review. The Latimer Review is done by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and the Latimer House principles are benchmarks for democratic legislators, particularly around the importance of separation of powers. And what they said is that in view of the executive, this is about the ACT, in view of the executive's interest in deliberative engagement, which was those projects back in 2018, the potential for a citizens' council should be explored as a structure that complements and supplements the Legislative Assembly. Now, I'm not sure what has happened as a result of that, but there may well be a role for CAPAD in helping to educate the community on how real participatory democracy can be embedded in our way of governing in an ethical and effective way that suits our situation. I think the time's right for broad community discussion, perhaps even via a citizens' assembly, about what mechanisms and structures would work best in the ACT and what we need to do to achieve them. So my question, I guess, to you is, what if all of that seems relevant for us, and what might we do about it? And I'm now going to close the share screen. Come back.
Well, if we could all sort of clap you in public, Lynn, we'd be pausing now. So thank you. Yeah, here we go. There's some silent clapping.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lynn. And what we might do is reflect on your question to all of us. What comes up for you about what Lynn shared with you, and what can we do about it? So we're a small enough group here for the next 50 minutes just to maybe give each person a chance to share, because some of you here in this meeting have been involved in these processes as well, and might want to share your experience and what you think we should do with it to move forward. And those of you who are from out of town would also be curious about saying, you know, how can we take this to go further? So if you've got any questions or comments to Lynn or the team that did this work, maybe you can just put your hand up, or there's a little button you can push somewhere that can let us know as well. Or you could also type your statement or question into the chat, and we'll make sure that we get each person to have a chance to express themselves before anyone expresses themselves twice, just to honour representativeness and participation. And then we can go into a deeper conversation with any issues that come up. So has anyone got anything they'd like to say or a question to Lynn?
First of all, I think it would be just useful to remind people that we are recording this, and if somebody has an objection to us recording it, please let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So yeah, you'll notice that that recording's on. So when we finish this up, if you feel like there's anything that you're concerned about, let us know. But also just be aware that our preference is to be able to share it. So maybe we speak in a way that can honour all of that. So Rob, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yes. I'm really, I typed this question into the chat, but I'll ask it. I'm really interested in the possibility of running deliberations at a lower cost than they normally than is normally involved. I mean, I was involved in one in the city of Yarra, and it cost something like $200,000, which seems like a lot of money to me, because I'm interested in the concept of whether citizens groups could run deliberations, and I'm particularly thinking of the sort of groups that we're looking at, the electorate level action groups, because even if you have a quite a large group of people, as Indi did have through their kitchen table conversations, somebody could still say, well, is this group representative of the whole electorate? Whereas if you did have a randomly sampled group, you could overcome that issue, particularly on contentious policy issues that people wanted to talk about. Or MPs could run them, So I'm wondering, Lynn, whether, or anyone, whether that's been explored anywhere.
I might start. I think one of the things we've talked about in our group is the issue of sortition and how to actually make that work for us in a reasonable way. I'm not quite sure if any of the others want to comment on that, whether we got too far with it. But I think your point, Rob, about sortition being important to the credibility of these processes is really important. And so that would be one issue to deal with. It seems to me one of the other things, that a lot of the principles that have come out of the OECD work are applicable, at any level. But where we might run into difficulty, I guess, are first of all around participation, in that often people who are more well off or who are time rich have the ability to participate, whereas someone who might have been selected by sortition, if you can't pay them some money or pay their babysitting or whatever, that can create a barrier. I think the other issue to think about is the importance of expert information and how you would bring that to bear on these processes without some fees. And it may be that there is a way to do that, but and I'm not sure if in all these processes the experts were actually paid. Do you know that, Petra, from say with our ACT things?
I think that on the whole, I think that I'm not really sure about that, but I'm of the persuasion that they volunteered their time in order to have their point of view brought forward. Yeah. And so that would be, that would be a really great thing to kind of bolster a lower, a sort of a local type thing, if we could get that expertise without cost. Petra, or Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
I've got something else to say, Rob. Just one of the things that came up in the OECD report, I didn't find this myself, but a colleague who works in the art of hosting community, which is basically participatory processes for facilitating groups. Her name's Rosa, actually, Zubizarreta. She's an American facilitator who does dynamic facilitation. I won't go into the process of it, but there's a community in Austria headed up, and they've actually, in their local government area, this is a fantastic innovation, I reckon. They've got an office called the Office of Questions for the Future. And maybe that's broken up in terms of the translation from Austrian, but a fellow called Manfred, who I've got a video of doing a presentation about the work that their community has done in this space. They've identified that paying consultants all the time to run these processes in a very rigorous way really soaks up a lot of resources from the community. And dynamic facilitation is a methodology that honours the quality of those characteristics of good deliberation that Lynn shared with us, but actually has a simpler process. And really, if that process was honoured by the local community and they felt trusted in it, you could randomly select people, but do this simpler and cheaper process either with public servants or even with the politicians if they honoured the process, because really it's a process of listening respectfully to each person and capturing their wisdom up on a chart, and then having the group hear all of that and come up with ways of moving forward, rather than making it antagonistic and having people challenge each other. It's always about building on things, about listening and creating solutions that everyone can agree with. So I'll send you the video that Rosa shared with me about that. But I think we could also, actually, I've been talking to Rosa about running a workshop like this, and we might put that on the radar for the next few months to host that sort of work in Australia as well. So even citizens could do that as well.
Yeah.
That would help a lot, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Excellent.
One of the things I also thought that our little genuine citizen participation action group could do would be to look in more detail at some of the examples from around the world to see, just the range of processes and the range of approaches, like what you've said, Mark, because I think kind of gaining more knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground could be really useful.
Yeah. I noticed Kevin's got his hand up next. Do you want to go next, Kevin?
Yes, just a place where you can find some money to do these things is to get governments to use less consultants in terms of coming up with policies. There seems, particularly in Canberra, well, in the federal government, it seems that that an enormous amount of money is being spent on consultants to come up with things that citizens' juries and citizens' deliberative consultation can do a much better job at. So if we're looking for money, look for the money in diverting some of the resources that are currently being used by governments with external consultants.
Thanks, Kevin. And Sue, you've got your hand up there. Do you want to speak?
Thank you, Mark. Yes. What really resonated in Lynn's presentation for me was the emphasis on trust, which is, to me, absolutely critical in the process. It's really a question about deliberative processes, and it goes into the question I put on in the chat, which is, how do you ensure that these mechanisms are representative, that those who see themselves as interested can actually input to the process, and how do you ensure accountability back to the political community that is affected by the process? Because for all the flaws of representative democracy, it does provide for input and accountability. Obviously not travelling very well in many respects, but yeah, whatever, if there's to be trust, there has to be that sense of representation and accountability as well, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sue.
Shall I?
Do you want to say anything about that, Lynn? Yeah.
Yeah, I would. I think, again, one of the things that I found interesting with the OECD Good Principles was they talked about representation and inclusiveness. And I think they're not always the same thing. And the public servant from Finland also talked about giving voice to people who often don't have a voice. So that's one aspect, I think, where even with kind of just a straightforward sortition, what the OECD was saying is that you may need to overrepresent some groups in order to get that sort of broad perspective. But I thought you were also talking about, were you talking about expert and diverse input as well, or just the voice of the people? Sorry, you're on mute, Sue.
No, in theory, a representative democracy is giving everyone a voice through the election itself. Now that's the theory. We know the practice is a long way away because institutional design and gaming of the system really affects the outcome. But it's, if there is a deliberative group that's considering a particular public policy matter, how do those who see themselves as interested in that process actually get to engage in it. So it's not about expert input, but it's about constituents input. Because in theory, as constituents, we can go and bleat to our member of parliament. How do you go and bleat to a deliberative committee?
Okay. There are a couple of aspects of that. And Petra, did you want to speak to that one? Were you?
Yeah, I think there's a really great example of that was in one of the Irish assemblies, looking at the question of legalising abortion. At the time, there was a massive interest from the public, and I'm not sure now. I think the actual assembly was something like 100 people, or 99. The way that they included all those thousands of others who were taking an active interest in the dialogue and following it from day to day on social media as well, was to allow more or less a chat input, which was then fed to the participants of the jurors on the assembly, was fed to them before the next meeting. I'm not sure how they screened. I don't think they screened it, but perhaps just categorized the comments. But in any case, it was possible for all of those who were interested to make a comment and input in virtually in real time before the next meeting session of the assembly.
I just might add a comment to that too, that I haven't done a lot of reading on the UK Citizens Assembly on climate, but I did read that in addition to doing demographic sortition, they also screened people in terms of their views about climate, that they had a range of views about climate as well. Diverse demographics is quite interesting. And I wonder, Petra, you might be able to comment on this too, whether experts...
Sorry, Lynn, I couldn't hear the question.
Sorry, did you, yeah?
Your screen is freezing and your audio is freezing as well.
Oh no.
On and off. So, sorry, could you just... I don't know if it's going to be any better, but have another go.
Yeah, okay. I was picking up Sue's comment about bringing the diverse perspectives in, and I was going to suggest that maybe you might be able to talk about also with the CTP in ACT that the advice was quite diverse and that there's quite an effort to make sure that that's so, that there's a range of views around that. So, but I thought you might be better able to comment on that.
I know that there was a diversity of views, and although the Law Society claimed they weren't represented, they actually were. I don't know, maybe, Caroline, what about you? Can you contribute to this question?
Look, with that one, I think what it really highlighted was the importance of real expert advice and being able to ask the experts questions and get responses back. It was particularly, I noticed this because I dealt with it sort of after it had come through the citizens' jury process. The citizens' jury did the broad brush, but there were so many details left, and the inability for either the jury or for the parliamentarians such as myself afterwards to get information about how you could actually interpret and do what was being talked about was incredibly frustrating. I think one of the most important things for any of these processes is a good range of experts and the ability for the citizens jury or whatever it will be called to actually have two-way interaction. And one of the most important things is making sure that there's a full range, so you don't just have two views represented, as it were, when there's going to be 4 or 5 or whatever. So it was really frustrating that we could have done much better with better expert advice out of that particular process. But I think the process of getting the jury for that one actually worked fairly well, except for the unreasonable refusal to allow anyone who had an active CTP claim as part of the process. I don't think that helped anybody.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline.
Actually, that's very valuable insights, Caroline, for you being a legislator, using the output of a citizens' jury and feeling your need for more distinctions in the deliberation. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I can say that's not just for the citizens' juries. Every party has policy which is written sort of in fairly broad statements, and then turning the policy into actual practice. This isn't a problem just for the Greens. This is a problem for all political parties. You know, what does it actually mean when you say you'll stop whatever? How will you stop it, etc., etc.
So, Caroline, would you like a citizens' jury on implementation next?
That would be really interesting. Although I think it might be too broad a topic, because implementation, you know, in the planning system is quite different from implementation in the health or the education system. But I think it is important, if you're dealing with a real issue that where you hope the results will be implemented, that the citizens' jury thinks about, okay, if this is what we think should happen, how are you actually going to be able to do that? One of the most frustrating things is we pass heaps of laws, they're not actually, there's no compliance for them, and we just, no point to it.
Which kind of comes back to that accountability issue that Sue raised, that it's a bit more complex, isn't it, than just, you know, you should do this or you should do that. The implementation, that's the really critical part.
Yeah. And it comes back a lot to the resources put to the implementation. I mean, look, we're seeing it right now with the coronavirus. We've got the rules, and then how are they enforced? How do we ensure they're complied with? I mean, that's where the issues are.
Thanks, Carolyn. That's great. Janet, I noticed you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just was picking up on the discussion about experts meshing together from right at the very beginning of the Q&A. There was a bit of discussion about who the experts were and whether they were volunteers. And now picking up on Caroline talking again about the the importance of the expert input, and sort of a bit just to sort of emphasise that if you rely on volunteers, then that's always going to be incredibly discriminatory against people who are working for a living. I mean, many of us do volunteer work, because we're in a position not to earn a living, but I think it's quite a problematic route to go down to say we would have people in that sort of situation as a volunteer. I think people who are bringing their professional, coming in their professional capacity should be paid for what they do, because otherwise I think it introduces another layer of non-transparency or possibility of gaming the system or whatever. Anyways, and ethically it's not a good thing either, and it quite often discriminates against women as well.
Thanks, Janet. Lynn, did you want to say anything about that?
No, I agree with it.
Yeah, that's right.
I agree with it, and at the same time I'm aware of Rob's issue, and it may be that we need to look at horses for courses a little bit, in that we haven't all got $200,000 to spend on a process like this, but how can we make whatever process we do as trustworthy as possible? And I think that's the fundamental principle. And it also comes back to the issues I think that Caroline raised around accountability and the practicality of implementation, so that the relationships that go into the pre-phase and the the project phase and the post phase are kind of just as important. You know, it's a journey, not a one-off project.
Yeah. Anybody else would like to make a comment or ask a question of Lynn's presentation?
I'd like to maybe just add a little bit more to this question of the how of implementation. Again, a really fabulous example of this was the question that was put to the Irish people about the legalisation of abortion. Rather than the Irish have a tradition of running referenda. It's a very common practice. So it was known that post citizens jury of 99 participants, that there would be a referendum, and that referendum would be for the whole of Irish society to make a decision on either yes or no of legalisation of abortion. The question for the citizens' jury, however, was not about yes or no. What they were deliberating on was, what would it mean in terms of implementation if the answer to the referendum was yes? What would it mean in terms of implementation if the answer to the referendum was no? So that the jury spent their time deliberating over such things as, if abortion were to be allowed, under what circumstances would it be allowed? At what term during the pregnancy would it be allowed? Would it be allowed only in cases of rape, or for medical reasons, or for any reason at all? Those sorts of things were the questions that were deliberated on, and they came up with a very clear outline that if the populace of Ireland agreed to, if the overall vote was for a yes, then this is what it actually meant. This was what that yes meant. It meant that it was abortion would be legal in this circumstance, at this phase, term of the pregnancy, and to be done in this particular way, etc., etc. So, and if it meant no, then what did that mean? Did it mean no always, under every circumstance, and so on? And so when the people went to referendum, the Irish people actually could read what it was that they were voting for. They already knew, if I vote yes, this is what I'm saying yes to. If I vote no, I'm saying no to this. So as it turned out, they voted yes. They would agree to abortion, but it was under those particular conditions. So once that referendum was finished, it went straight to Parliament, and it could be implemented without any difficulty, because all the boundaries around it were already worked through pretty well. Yeah, so that was one way to get around the difficulty of implementation.
They could have done with that for Brexit, couldn't they?
Yeah,
exactly. Yes. Would have saved a lot of time and money and angst.
I think it's a really good principle, I think, for almost any referendum, because often they're presented in such black and white terms, whereas that thinking is really important. And it reminds me when we were doing our consultation with various participants in the Canberra facilitators, and one of the things I said is getting that question right is really important, and often a whole lot of it is done before the project even begins, working with government to get the question right. And I think Petra's example is just a brilliant one of showing how asking the right question can be really important in getting the sort of outcome that's implementable.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lynn. Lynn, just to let you know, your connection to the internet's a little bit cutting in and out. So
that must have been very annoying, was it? While I was speaking,
we felt your passion and enthusiasm, and just
I couldn't hear anything I was saying.
It was fine for most of your presentation.
Oh yeah, the presentation wasn't interrupted at all.
Yeah.
Oh,
Just wanted to check with anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet, whether they'd like to say something about this or ask a question. John?
I found this very interesting. I haven't been involved with any of these projects. I did have the privilege of being down in Indi when they were having an open day, which I found fascinating. In fact, I've been involved in quite another project with my wife. We travel around in our motorhome and talk about making the Australian Constitution a document from Australia, but it's not a consultation. I'm giving them a historical background to how we got our Constitution and an idea I have for how we might make the translate the document from a UK enactment to an Australian written document without changing its substantive effect. So I cut across a lot of this stuff, but I've been away, and so I'm really very interested in all this stuff, but I can't think of much. I'm interested in what was said about referendums. That's very interesting, and I think we can learn a lot from the Irish. But no, I can't specifically contribute to this, but it's very interesting for me.
Thanks, John. Anyone else? Peter, I noticed you've put a lot of resources into, sorry, I saw a few hands go up there. Peter, you've put a lot of resources into the chat. Did you just want to mention some of those, where they are? And I know you've given some links there. Did you want to speak to any of that before I ask Barbara and...
just Mark, yeah, okay, I'll just quickly say I've put links to our report, Lynn's report on the review of the citizens' processes into the chat. I've put a link to the OECD report that Lynn was talking about into the chat, and I've also put the link that Mark was talking about, Manfred Hegregel from Austria, into the chat. If you want to follow them up, they're there.
Thanks,
and they're
Peter.
all on our website.
Okay. Barbara, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, look, I came in fairly late to this, so I probably missed all sorts of things in the beginning about what is being or what what we're trying to achieve with this workshop. But on the question of trust, and well, more than trust, there are so many different layers of things that need to be looked at or need to be worked out if ordinary people are going to feel that they can have a say in things. And I mean, one of the very personal examples that I've got of where I don't know where you're supposed to start trusting anybody was I had a Mr. Fluffy house. And that, leaving aside all of the drama of that, afterwards, in fact, about a year or so ago, we were asked, the ACT government asked us, did we want to have some sort of legacy as a result of all the Mr. Fluffy stuff? And they asked, could we set up like an advisory committee and get report prepared. So we did. Some of some of us volunteered to be on the committee, and we had consultations as much as we could with all the people who'd been affected by the Mr. Fluffy business. And we prepared the committee didn't prepare the report, it was done by consultants, but I think it was a pretty good report. The main thing that came out of all the consultations was that people didn't want a plaque in the park or something like that. What they wanted was an inquiry into the way the whole thing had come about, and how it was, like how the asbestos had been put in the houses, why it wasn't stopped at the time, and then how the whole thing was handled afterwards. But there was more or less just a brushing aside of that and saying, no, there's not going to be an inquiry. But there was really no response from the government. There's been no response since. And I don't know where, I mean, this has just been a source of not just frustration, but real distress for a whole lot of people in Canberra, and this so-called legacy is, you know, just distressed people even more. So I mean, this is no answer to anything that I've got. What I'm asking is, at what point do we start trying to intervene or make some sort of contribution to a policy decision? And if a policy decision is made that we don't like, you know, where do we intervene? And I mean, I don't even, you know, citizen juries, I'm sure, you know, are good, but how do you even, if you're an ordinary person out there who have no real connections to anything political going on, how do you get involved? What's the, you know, who do you even refer to? How do you even know what's happening? Sorry, all I've got is 100,000 questions, really.
And did you want to see if you could answer any of Barbara's concerns there?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it might be a question for Caroline.
Okay, look, I think they're all really good questions. I'll maybe just leave the Mr. Fluffy one as a specific one, but this is partly a problem of our media falling to pieces. I mean, once upon a time, most places, or Canberra in particular, had media which was sort of a source of information, at least about the major things happening, and I think that's made it even harder. But it's always been the situation that the people with spare time and resources do a lot better in terms of influencing policy. You know, that's always been, and I think citizens' juries and things can help redress that, but that's all. I mean, in the short instance, I mean, I'd say in the Canberra context, start with your local MLAs, and there's an election on right now, start with all the parties. And these days, the internet with, you know, change.org, Facebook, etc., etc. I mean, talk to Janet with the Women's Peace Congress and stuff. I mean, you don't have a lot of Parliament's politicians are never the actual leaders. There has to be someone out in advance, and then they can follow the first wave, but they're very highly unlikely to be the first wave of people on any issue. I don't know if that's helpful or
yeah,
not.
No, yes, I know what you're saying, and just for your information, Carolyn, I am involved in the Women's Climate Network with Janet and Lynn. But I mean, I was only using the Mr. Fluffy stuff as an example because it was something that I had been closely involved in myself. What I'm asking about is what people who are out there in the normal, you know, everyday part of the community who are who are having to earn a living, who, you know, got children that they've got to look after and all the 1,000 things that go with that. I mean, the amount, you know, as several people said, volunteers. It is an awful lot of stuff is done by volunteers, and the volunteers are mostly older because they're no longer working. I don't know how we get messages through, or how people who are very you know, who are just trying to conduct their normal day-to-day life, but who don't have the time or the knowledge or even the interest, if you like, to really be involved in things that would give them a voice in any sort of policy decision. So I don't know. I mean, people have to feel, A, they have to feel interested for a start, and B, they have to feel they're getting some information through to them. I mean, with the best will in the world, I don't have as much information. I sometimes miss out on seeing things because I haven't read something in the paper or didn't hear it on the news or think, how did people know about that? How did I miss that? So, you know, if you're not really looking for things, you're going to miss out on an awful lot of information. So I just, I mean, I suppose I'm just concerned that, you know, if we're talking about, you know, real democratic participation, this is a really big job to try and make information and available to everybody so that they really can participate.
Thanks,
You're
Barbara.
totally correct. It's a really, really big job. I mean, even in my position where you could say, so that's my full-time job, there are a lot of things that happen, even within the ACT government sphere. I have no idea what they are. And part of the reason we have representative democracy is because it's really not possible for all of us to be experts on the things that affect us. I mean, you might be experts, say, on education, but you won't be on health as well, and public transport and planning. We have to have some mechanisms that delegate decisions to, not that we don't all have to be, we've got a too big and complicated society for us to all be individually part of the things. But the more other question, which is equally valid, is how do people who are basically busy in their lives, which actually have the time, energy to be usefully involved in the political process? Again, that's a hard one, but you know, as I said before, I mean, Facebook petitions, talk to your local member, and etc. They all can. They actually do make a difference in a small place like Canberra. You know, things have changed because it's what the community wants. Absolutely, that happens. You can see it happening in the planning system right now with the interventions of Mr. Barr in Kingston, saying that things which a year ago would have been regarded as just business as usual are maybe not. Sorry, I can't offer better. I don't think I can offer better solutions.
You don't have the answer
Thanks.
to everything, Carolyn. What a pity.
I noticed Bernard or Gilles, you had your hand up there. Do you want to say anything?
Well, I suppose, thank you for everybody's contributions. I was just wondering, and perhaps this is more a question for Peter, so he might have to unmute himself again, is how is the process progressing regarding the dissemination, or should I say the implementation of what GCAPG can be doing with the upcoming elections? What practical things can we do in the short term to practice a bit of this, and without it being overly demanding? So again, I remember last time the last chat we had, that we were talking about using online methods of various descriptions, and I was just wondering how that was progressing and how we could, the members, people interested, get more involved in that process with the upcoming elections.
All right, thank you, Gilles. So I'll take a double opportunity here. One, I mean, Barbara's raised this idea of how do people who are busy living their lives get involved in politics, and I mean, there isn't a straight answer to that. The answer, I think, is complicated because of the way our representative democracy has evolved. We have learned not to be participatory because we were leaving it up to the reps. So I guess one of the things that we're trying to do, and the election statement is an example of how we're trying to do this, is to say, well, look, you know, one of the ways that you can get involved is by at least choosing who you vote for and putting your vote somewhere for somebody who is more likely to be a good representative than not. And so, you know, we all have to go and vote. In terms of some of the bigger issues that Barbara has raised, I mean, I think it's a process of evolution, and all I can really say from my own perspective and GCAPG's perspective is we just got to keep working our way through this system, nibbling off ways of getting better government with the people, growing the understanding within the political sphere with the parliamentarians that government with is a possibility, and also continuing to talk to people about, well, this is a possibility, you can govern with. If you think about the process of governments as a sausage, you know, there's agenda setting, there's deliberation, there's decision making, there's implementation, there's review and evaluation, and the challenge that CAPAD is putting out there is how do we get citizens participating in each of those processes within the government sphere? Now, the neat thing is many publics, citizens juries, things like that, give us a tool that we can use. And so the question for us is, how do we work with government to get this tool used better, using the sort of evaluations that we've done and the OECD has done? So that's not like this is how we do it. More, we actually know what the pathway is. We have to keep working at doing the pathway. In terms of your specific question, Gilles, around what are we doing in this space? I mean, to some extent, we're providing the information to members and supporters, and we sort of have this expectation that people will pick up and run with this themselves as much as they can. I mean, we are putting stuff on social media. We are talking to candidates. We are talking to political parties. We're trying to get stuff in the media, both to raise the profile of a candidate statement and also to raise our profile with candidates, so candidates fill in the candidate statements. But I mean, really, it's up to you guys to start pushing this as well. So when, you know, people door knock, or you see somebody down at the local shops, or you get the bit of cardboard in the letterbox saying, what can we do for you? Zap them an email and say, well, fill in this candidate statement.
Thank you, Peter. Lynn, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to really emphasise the importance of reframing government with one of the things that really struck me about David Matthews' little piece, and it comes back to what you were saying, Caroline, is that there are some things only citizens can do, and there are some things only government can do. But unless there's that kind of partnership, you're not going to have a strong democracy. So while it's only a language thing, to me, it's actually really quite critical, and it opens up a whole different way of operating. So I just wanted to kind of emphasise that, and you picked it up too, Peter. But the other thing I was going to say is with the Belgian model, over time, almost every citizen in that place will have the opportunity to participate in a deliberative process. I think it's going to take a few years, but what that will do is build an expectation among the citizens that they do have a role and they do have the capacity to contribute. And so while we might not have that, I think if we can start promoting that kind of message, it's a really important one. And finally, one of the things that really struck me when we talked to participants in the processes that were held in the ACT is how much they learned and how much they valued the experience and how it changed their attitude to government. And so I don't think you can underestimate the importance of doing these processes and doing them properly to kind of build that momentum and build the capacity of citizens to take part, even in a small way, role, and they have a right to raise these sorts of issues and to be part of it. That's it from me.
Thanks, Lynn. Now, I'm aware that Tony and Plaxi haven't had a chance to ask anything or say anything, so I'll just leave that space there. Tony, is there anything you wanted to comment on or ask a question on?
Just unmute. Look, I missed the most of the presentation. I dialed in a little bit late, but I was just attracted to one thing earlier that I heard, and that referred to the Irish question and the style of questioning that the deliberative group looked at, about knowing what the outcome path would mean for yes and the outcome path meant for no. And although in Indi we've done some reasonable things over the years, that really attracted me as something that we could pick up here in the style of our engagement and in as far as how you take it forward and such. But the other part, just talking about in recent conversation here, it was just occurring to me a little bit about what would this thing look like that we're all broadly talking about if we suddenly had a exponential opportunity, and we all know what exponential means now out of the COVID-19, and it's and what would it actually mean about being prepared for citizens? We're currently talking about a process of trying to get people engaged, you know, putting their hand up and encourage participation. But what would it actually mean like if, yes, they started to participate and participate fully? And what kind of thinking do we need to have done to actually prepare different pathways for people who are very advanced in their thinking and want to do things versus those that are a bit slower to engage but still interested? And whereas I'm just putting it out there because the things that are coming to my mind in that a lot of the conversation is about you know, 101 engagement and how you kind of get that and so on, and the distinction between the role of citizens, what they can have. And I like that's just been raised there about reframing it and understanding the very clear role citizens have and what the elected parliamentary officials or delegates have, and how we actually expand on that thinking to actually kind of accelerate, if you will, some of the way through this. So it's a really high quality conversation being raised here. I'm really having some interesting thoughts on what it actually means. So I'm a bit of an observer rather than contributor. So I'll thank you for that.
Thanks, Tony. Lynn, did you want to say anything in response to Tony?
I'm inspired, Tony.
Okay.
Actually, the other thing, Tony, it's lovely that both Helen Haynes and Kathy McGowan was able to bring people from the community in as a team with her into the parliamentary processes and meetings and everything. So your community's learning about all of those things and was sitting at the table at some really important meetings.
Yeah, that's a really solid thing that is happening. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, I'm just aware that Plaxy's unable to talk to us because her microphone's not working, but she's put in chat, I have to leave now. Oh no, that's Janet. Plaxy says, hi, all my mics not working, but no questions. Have found this very interesting indeed. Biggest aha was Lynn's point now that the Aus-Belgian model will create an expectation in all citizens that at some point they will be involved to participate in a process. This, I think, will change culture dramatically. Now, Plaxy, we can't see you or hear you, but hopefully I've read that out appropriately. We're coming up to the end of our time and everyone's had a chance to speak, but anyone else want to just say anything as a way of moving forward or some energy that's arisen in them that they want to take forward? Rob? Better unmute yourself first, Rob.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is because it's until now, unlike Belgium, in Australia, it's entirely up to the discretion of governments to have these things or not. And so they don't happen very often. And so most citizens don't know about them. And I think that has two problems. One is that there's a kind of a vicious circle, or the absence of a virtuous circle, where because people don't know about them, there's no community demand for them to happen, and so they don't happen. And the other one is that they're not serving a very valuable potential purpose, and that is that they could really help to restore faith in democracy in Australia. And so I was really excited, Lynn, about what you were saying about the idea of sortition in the ACT as a kind of, am I getting it right? Would it be a sort of review of legislation? Is that how it was envisaged, or?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what you're meaning, Rob.
Were you talking in your original talk about the idea of some sort of citizens' deliberation of legislation in ACT?
There has been some talk about possibly looking at what kind of processes citizens might want for involvement, but I don't think, as far as I'm aware with CAPAD, that we have looked at that specific issue.
Yeah, because I think what it really needs to sort of take a quantum leap into people's consciousness is for some government to, as they have done in Belgium, to institute it on a regular, systematic basis. And would seem to me that the ACT would be the ideal place because it has a unicameral, that's right, it's a unicameral system at the moment, isn't it? Yeah. And so there's only one level, so there could be 2 levels, and it seems like a pretty progressive electorate. I mean, I think that, you know, it would be good to go all out to try and encourage the government, the parliament to, in Canberra, whatever it's called, the assembly, to consider this seriously. Is there any chance of that?
Well, you got one of the members of the assembly there with a thumb up, so she's a pretty good advocate for a lot of this stuff too, Rob.
Yeah.
So,
right.
but she is on her own a bit. Look, we haven't got a lot of chance to go into all of this, and Sue's got her hand up as well. Sue, did you want to say anything? You're on mute, Sue.
No, my hand's not up, so...
Oh, okay. Right, yeah. Well,
just in response to that, Rob, we did have some discussions with the UC, University of Canberra, around some next steps. And perhaps when we meet with them again, we might talk about your suggestion and among a range of others about what the next steps might be, because I think you're quite right in saying that to build something into the system is kind of more powerful than going for more little projects. If we could do that, it would be fantastic. And the world would be looking at us, Caroline, as well as looking at East Belgium.
Yeah. Petra, one last thing from you. You're on mute.
Thanks. Sorry. They'll be looking at that little place called Canberra that claims to be the capital of Australia. I think that's a really great thing. That also, I agree, Rob, that's a way of actually addressing the system rather than looking at all the little bits of the system and trying to change, things from below. In a way, all these things we've talked about are going to contribute. But if we can also change the structure somewhat, that would help a lot. It could really quicken the whole process. And something that, well, Lynn, when you were giving your introduction, you named a lot of advantages to institutionalising a deliberative process, like enabling the government to come to better decisions, sharing and addressing wicked problems that were very contentious by actually allowing citizens to make the decisions, building that social capacity, building citizen engagement. There was something else I thought of too, was it would enhance and optimise the opportunity to streamline and improve the process iteratively over time, because you would just be, provided you did have, you're following through with those principles of good process, of which one was review. If you were doing that review every single time, you couldn't really help but improve the process. So it may not be flaw-free at the outset, but it would get better and better over time. Particularly, that would improve exponentially also if more and more citizens become involved. Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to wind up here, but I'm just aware, Peter, do you want to just flag what's coming up next on the GCPAG series of Zoom discussions?
Sure, thank you, Mark. So the University of Canberra, the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis, Mark Evans there, they've a few years ago, or for the last few years, there's been doing something called the Democracy 100 project, where they've been looking at citizens' views about governance and around this idea of trust and trust in governance. And they've discovered some interesting things. And out of this, they've crafted another set of projects around under the banner of Democracy 2025, which is looking about how we, what changes we can make to democracy in Australia over the next 5 years. There's some stuff about this in our newsletter, so I won't talk about it too much, but just to say that we've invited Mark Evans to come along probably on the 30th of August to give us, to tell us about the Democracy 100 project and to enlighten us more on the Democracy 2025 project and where they're heading, and maybe, you know, some ideas about how we could get involved in that.
Lovely. Well, look, let's just all congratulate Lynn for today in sharing that with us, and thank you all for coming along. If you've got any questions, just send us an email and